Welcome to the Unstoppable Product Pioneer Podcast, the podcast for business and product leaders ready to turn vision into execution and misalignment into momentum. I'm Tamar Stoltz, and I'm on a mission to help you create clarity, streamline execution, and drive meaningful results. In each episode, I sit down with industry experts who share their insights, lessons, and wins, giving you the tools and strategies you need to turn alignment into your superpower. It's time to own your expertise, lead with clarity, and become unstoppable. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another awesome episode of the Unstoppable Product Pioneer Podcast. I am so super excited to be here for another amazing episode. And today is it's actually a really special episode for me, I have to say, selfishly, personally, for those of you who are listening, or who have been following, this podcast has been making a lot of exciting changes slowly in terms of the different topics that we're talking about. There's going to be some new exciting updates to the name in the coming weeks and lots of really exciting things. But one thing that has been consistent from the beginning, because of who inspired me to start this podcast, and the first episode guest that we had, Phil Hornby, the one thing that has been consistent, I think, from the beginning is my source of inspiration, motivation, encouragement, community, my people. And so for those of you who haven't already guessed who I'm talking about, I am talking about AJ&Smart, my AJ&Smart family. And AJ&Smart, if you don't know who they are, I mean, there's just no words. I mean, to say that they're a product and innovation design studio, I mean, that does not do justice. Go look them up, search them on YouTube. I'll put the links down below. Go to workshopper.com, facilitator.com, go to school. I don't know, find them. They're incredible. But today we have a really special guest that I want to welcome to the stage. Welcome, Amr Khalifeh. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Amr is a senior consultant at AJ&Smart. And again, I don't know, senior consultant, it doesn't do justice. For those of you who are in the community, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, there are programs and communities, and then there are programs and communities. And I have been part of the AJ&Smart community since 2021. So I think I have enough years under my belt to confidently say that they are one of the most special, unique companies, families. They take their clients in as family, and it's an absolute honor for me to be a member of the family, but to have one of the real members of the family on the show. So really, really, this is extra special for me, and I just really appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Tamar. And yeah, it's amazing to have people like you with your energy in the community. Like, honestly, we're kind of what we do, because we talk about like workshopping and facilitation. We're basically just facilitators in the community, and it really wouldn't be what it is without people like you in it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got to where you're at?
Yeah, I'll try not to spend too much time on that, just so that it's not too boring. And I don't know, maybe like the thing that I'll focus on is for anybody who's maybe listening to this, who feels like they haven't found their thing yet, because I've met a lot of people that they just find their thing in university. Like, immediately is like, I know what I want to do. This is it. And then they go on to do that for most of their life, and been always kind of envious of that. For me, it worked a little bit differently. And it's like that journey kind of included a lot of uncertainty, and kind of frustration, and what do you call it? Imposter syndrome, which, I would say sometimes still kind of crops up here and there again. But the way it worked for me is I've always like loved design, but I've always had like zero artistic skill. So like I couldn't dream of like going to design school. And so, but I knew that I also loved tech and the tech world. And so when it came time, and I was always like terrible at school, like absolutely terrible. I hated it, every minute of it. Just didn't work for how my brain was wired. And so I finished school like by the skin of my teeth, and like almost like flunked the final year of school. And then when it came time to decide what I wanted to do for university, like I said, I love design, but knew that I couldn't go to a design school. So instead, I felt like, oh, I love tech as well. So what's the closest thing to tech? It's like, all right, maybe like programming, software engineering. So I went into that. So I have a degree in software engineering, and I studied that for 5 whole years. And for the entirety of the 5 years, I was terribly like conflicted and confused about whether or not I should continue. Feeling like, because once you've met like a real quote unquote real programmer, there are people who are just wired for this stuff. You know that, oh, this is what a programmer is, and it's not me, and I just know now, right? And I knew that um I could probably, if I worked really hard at it, become like an okay, good, maybe even better than good programmer. But I knew that it would be just like swimming against the tide, and I was never gonna be really I was never gonna like stand out as an amazing programmer, because I've seen kind of what that is firsthand with a lot of my friends who are still like my best friends to this day. Um, but I never ended up kind of changing majors, because there was also never like another great option for me to go to. So I finished that. Then my first job was just like a front end web development job. Um, and I started that, in like a few weeks into that job, the the department that I was in got shut down. And the company that I was at were like, okay, so this isn't like, don't worry, you're not fired, but the stuff that you were doing, it's just like no longer available. So obviously you can try to see if there's something else that you would like to do, or like you're free to look for another job. And they said, but we think you would do well in this sales engineer role. I was like, what's that? They said like, oh, you seem to be, um, good at presenting, and you have a technical background. And so what a sales engineer is it's somebody who kind of tags along with a salesperson and demos a software, so the client can understand how this works for them. And like this role, you would only find for very, very big, systems and pieces of software. So the company I was working at was a reseller for Salesforce, which is like a massive CRM. So this was in Malaysia, um, and they were the local reseller for Salesforce in Malaysia. So I did that for a while, and then I kind of from there was like, okay, this is cool, and I started going to all these meetings, and then I started building relationships with the clients, or with the prospects. And so after we close a deal, then the team who takes that on are called the business development teams, right? Like that we had these BDs at our company. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I could maybe do that. And so I started to do that a little bit. And then the company where I was working, like nobody was maintaining the website. I was like, oh, I could maybe do that. And so I started maintaining the website for them. And then they wanted to do like a little bit of marketing, and I found that interesting. I was like, oh, maybe we could start a newsletter. So we started a newsletter there. And then we were like, okay, but like it seems like, newsletter is cool, but like, people maybe don't want to read, so like maybe we start a YouTube channel. So I started a YouTube channel there. And I was just like constantly jumping between different things, like whenever I would get excited about something. And the really cool thing was that they gave me that freedom to kind of be floating, and every time, so long I was able to convince them that this was something that was good for the company, and no one else, we didn't have anybody else who was doing that, they were like, yeah, go for it. If it's kind of, good for marketing or sales or whatever it is, feel free to do that. And so I jumped between a million different things. And in that period, I was always still kind of reading up and like just in the tech world, like always obsessed with that. And I started to find out that there was this thing called like UX, because up until that point, I had no idea that UX was a thing. So this was back, by the way, like back in 2014, 15 ish. And so UX was definitely like a thing by that point, but it wasn't so prevalent. Like for a lot of people, you would say like, oh, I'm a UX designer. They'd be like, what is that? Like a lot of people hadn't heard of the term UX at the time. So about 10 years ago at this point. Um, and I started to kind of teach myself about it, and then wanted, after a while of like jumping between roles, I wanted to kind of change countries. I wanted to move from Malaysia to Germany because I had family here. And I decided like, all right, then maybe I could get a student visa. And so I found like a UX degree in Germany, and signed up for it, got accepted, and did a master's in what is like the old term for UX is called usability engineering. And so I did that. And the funny thing about how I then ended up at AJ and Smart was that like a few days after arriving in Germany, um, I was scrolling Instagram and I was following this designer. He was like, "Oh, I just attended a training by this really cool company in Berlin. They're called Agent Smart, and this was like such a good training. And they taught me all about Sprint." And I was like, "Oh, Sprint! I just picked up that book. I hadn't read it yet, but I had picked it up." I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe I should look into them." And so I started following them because like they were also based in Berlin. So my master's, like my university where I did my master's, wasn't in Berlin. It was in a different part of Germany. But I figured like, oh, it's always been the plan to then move to Berlin. So I was like going to do my master's for a couple of years, and then I wanted to move to Berlin anyway. So I figured like, all right, I'll just follow these guys. Maybe one day I'll apply for a job. Um, and then after I followed them, found out that they had a podcast. I was like, oh, great, I'm into podcasts. So I got the podcast and I started listening. And it turns out that it's between the founder of this company, Agent Smart, and the guy who wrote Sprint. I was like, okay, this is cool. I was interested in this book. I wanted to get into it anyway. So I started listening to the podcast. And it was very young at the time. They'd all like only put out like 10 episodes or so. And I started listening to them. And then in like somewhere in like between, I don't know, the 10 to 15 episode range, somewhere along, somewhere along there, Jonathan did an episode about this thing called the canvas strategy, which was the first time I'd ever heard of that term. And what the canvas strategy was, I know I said this was going to be short. I never end up making like a short version of the story.
That was great.
But Jonathan was talking about this canvas strategy, and he was like, there's this thing that I read about that's really cool, and nobody seems to do it. But every time I've done it, it's always like kind of paid back in spades. And the idea of the canvas strategy is very simple. It's all about kind of, and it's very focused on career growth. So it says that the basic principle basically says, if you want to get ahead in a certain area in your career, find somebody who's way ahead of you and find a way to kind of get in front of that person. And if you're successful at that, then they're gonna pull you up to their level, essentially. It's kind of like an amazing shortcut if you're able to pull it off. And so the way that works is that you find somebody that you look up to in whatever kind of skill or area that you're hoping to improve in, and then you start trying to find a way to get on that person's radar. And the best way to do that in most cases is to just do free stuff for them, like do stuff and send it to them. Kind of consume everything that they're putting out, see if they're kind of talking about some sort of challenge that they have, and then go and solve that challenge for them and say, here, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I'm a huge fan. And maybe nothing will come out of it, and that should be fine. Like a lot of people get this wrong in that they do that, but then they're immediately entitled, like they're almost expecting something in return. Whereas the key part about this is that you have to do it, realizing like, because even that, if that person wanted to help you, maybe there's nothing that they could do at the moment. Maybe they cannot hire you. Maybe they cannot give you any work where that you get paid. And so you can't, go into it expecting to get anything out of it. And you can't be entitled, right? So he was talking about that idea. And he said, like, this is exactly how he met Jake, Jake Knapp, the author of Sprint, which is sometimes I kind of, because I live in this bubble, I assume that most people know that. I actually have it like right behind me here. And it's one of the best books, best business books I've ever read, because it's so easy to read. And oh yeah, you have it too. Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's fantastic. It's see-through, exactly. It's a fantastic book. It literally transformed how Agent Smart works. I'm not going to go into like all of that right now, but he said the way that he got in front of Jake was that first he did a sprint for the UN food program or something like that. And then he wrote up kind of a almost like a blog post about it, and like that it was a really cool sprint. And then he submitted it to Jake. So Jake at the time was running this website collecting sprint stories from people. It's literally called sprintstories.com, I think. So he submitted it to him and emailed it to him, I think, or something like that. Like, hey, like here's like something with the UN. It's really cool. It's like a nonprofit thing, and it's showing how Sprint can help there. And Jake was like, oh, thank you. This is fantastic. And then after a while, Jonathan was like kind of getting more and more obsessed with sprints. So he said, like, all right, I really just kind of want to build a relationship with Jake. And so he said that he was visiting the US. So he emailed Jake and said, like, oh, I'm gonna have, I happen to be in town next week. It would be really cool if we could meet up. And I actually have like a business kind of opportunity for you, right? Obviously there were no plans for Jonathan to go except to meet Jake, so he kind of like just dropped it in casually. But then he went there, he met up with him, and he presented him this opportunity of like, all right, we're thinking of training people on how to do sprints, so would you like to kind of be a part of that? And obviously you would get a huge cut of that because you're the creator of sprints. So we would find the clients, we would book them, and you would just kind of show up to kind of talk about sprints. And that's how the relationship between AJ and Smart and Jake started, right? So like that was the episode of Jonathan talking about, here's the canvas strategy, here's how it works, here's how it helped out a lot. And he was saying, like, it was kind of just talking to the audience of like, oh, whatever you want to do in your career, kind of focus on doing that. I was like, that's a great idea. I'm going to try that on Jonathan. And at the time when they had done this podcast, Jonathan is always super energetic and like hyperactive and is always annoyed by detail work. And so for a lot of podcasts, at least at the time, I know like with YouTube and all of that stuff, it's less of a thing right now. But for podcasts at the time, the way most podcasts did it is that if you have a business podcast or anything where you're trying to teach people stuff, most podcasts included something called the show notes, which is just like linking to all of the books or like resources that they mention in the episode, right? Because podcast being an audio medium, you're listening to it while you're driving, while you're cycling, while you're doing the dishes, and it's annoying to have to like pause and like look up each like thing that gets mentioned in a podcast, right? But Jonathan and Jake's podcast, which at the time was called Product Breakfast Club, I think, did not have show notes, right? And Jonathan would mention on the podcast, like, oh, people keep asking me for like this show notes stuff or to include the links of the books that we're talking about. And he was like, I'm not going to do it. I hate this stuff. I hate detailed work and I don't want to do it. Right. So I was like, okay, here's a thing to try. So at the time, again, like this was around episode 15. I was like, okay, I'm just going to go back now, listen to 15 hours of the podcast again, and write down, like, essentially create the show notes for the podcast and write down every recommendation, every book, every idea that has a Wikipedia page that I can reference. And I created all of that. At the time, like Medium was like the hot thing. And so I created a Medium blog, a blog on medium.com, and created the show notes for Product Breakfast Club. And at the time, Jonathan had like a free Facebook group called Innovation Hackers that is no longer a thing anymore. That was way before like school or anything like that. So they had a free community on there. And all I did was like, I did the whole thing, invested kind of like about like 20 hours between listening to the podcast and collecting all this stuff. And I said, like, I heard you mention that, you didn't want to do this thing. So here, I did it. And he was like, oh, this is amazing. Thank you so much. Right. Like immediately got his attention. And that was it. I didn't ask for anything else. And then week after week, I would do the show notes for the next episode and the next episode. And I would post it again in the group. And I say like, all right, here are the show notes for this episode. Here are the show notes for this episode. And I did that, I think, for 6 months straight with nothing like in return, right? I was like, I'm just enjoying the show and I'm doing this thing. And then again, I wasn't living in Berlin at the time, so I had two sisters living in Berlin, and which was like the main reason for me moving to Germany. And I would visit them a lot. And so one time I wanted to kind of visit them, and it was also around the time that AJ&Smart had launched their very first course. It was the Design Sprint Masterclass. And I was like, all right, I'm just kind of I I'm determined to find a way into this company now. And so they put out the Design Sprint Masterclass. They did like, it was the first ever time they did like a webinar and kind of made like an offer. It was literally the first time then getting into this stuff. Um, and so I watched the webinar. I like looked at, they kind of announced the special price that would be available only for 48 hours. And it was a lot of money for me at the time as a student, not really like earning money. And I said like, no, this is going to be an investment. So I went ahead and I bought it. And they were like, oh, so that's really cool. The guy who like does the show notes also like bought the course now. And then they kind of emailed everyone's like, hey, like we want to like just ask you a few questions. Like the course hadn't even come out yet. It was kind of pre-order, but they were like, we want to like ask you a few questions about, how the course could be, as like one of the people who pre-ordered and all of that. And then I did the same thing that Jonathan did. I was like, oh, actually, I'm going to be in Berlin next week. Why don't I drop by and then you can ask me these questions in person? They were like, yeah, that's great. And I like bought a ticket and like I stayed with my sister and I went to Berlin and I met Jonathan for the first time. And I still have the photo from that, which is very cool to look back on. From the first time I met him, the first thing that and like a lot of people think is like, wow, Jonathan is way taller in person than I thought. And because you always see him next to like Jake Knapp and you always assume like, oh, Jake is a tall guy and Jonathan is like a normal person. But then when you meet Jonathan, it's like, oh, Jonathan is a tall guy and Jake is a literal giant. And that's what you realize when you meet Jonathan in person. And so I met him and spoke to him for a while. And he was like, dude, just let me know if there's anything, what you're doing with the show notes is so cool. And I was like, well, yeah, if you're offering internships, I wouldn't mind joining. And he was like, interesting. I don't know if we have internships, but I can put you in touch with the lead of my sprint team. And if he can interview you, and if he decides to kind of take you on, that will be his decision. But the only thing I can do is just kind of basically essentially get you an interview. And I was like, yeah, that's amazing. That's good enough. So he connected me with the sprint team lead, which was my first boss at AJ&Smart. His name is Rob. He's amazing. And so I met with Rob, kind of
Rob
did the
Hamlin?
interview. Rob Hamlin, yeah. Do you know Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Rob is amazing. I love Rob. So
Yay.
I
Shout out
interviewed
to
Rob.
Rob.
Yeah,
Take the
shout out
leap.
to Rob.
Okay.
Absolutely. And Rob was like, yeah, this is, we had a really cool conversation. He said like, I'm happy to kind of bring you on and for an internship. And at the time, part of the pitch for me was like, oh, but like, the reason I want an internship here is because I want to do my master thesis, because I was still studying at the time. I want to do my master thesis on sprints, right? And so like, what better place to be than AJ&Smart, which I was doing sprints all the time. And so I got my internship and I remained an intern for a really long time, partly for visa reasons, because until I finished my master's and switched it to a working visa, I was actually not allowed to have a full-time job. So I think I stayed on as an intern for like close to 2 years. And at one point I changed my Slack title to like senior intern, because like so many other interns had come after me and I was an intern for a really long time. And then finally, after like I kind of graduated and finished my thesis, I became a full-time employee at AJ&Smart. Even though like my official title was like intern, I was like I was facilitating workshops and sprints and like, but it was kind of like more of a technicality. So this turned out to be way longer than I was hoping. The thing that I wanted to highlight, if it's kind of useful to anyone, is, if you're kind of bouncing around in your career and you feel like, you haven't found the thing, and you kind of always had this imposter syndrome thoughts creeping up on you, that just if you keep kind of chasing, like if you keep looking for things that interests you, that excite you, and you kind of keep jumping on all the opportunities or find opportunities and use things like the Canvas strategy, which by itself is not, maybe before I had heard the advice about Canvas strategy, I would not have thought of Jonathan needing show notes for his podcast as an opportunity. But that kind of that like simple concept really flipped how I view opportunities and kind of how I view kind of working relationships and being able to um, make new connections with people. So I have no idea if any of that is at all related. It's probably not to anything that you usually discuss on the podcast, but
This is amazing.
I'll try to keep my other answers way shorter than this.
No, this is incredible. This is so amazing. I mean, oh, there's so much there that I would love to unpack that would, put us into the couple hours mark. But if I had to choose one thing to just highlight before we move on, I want people to understand, and if you didn't hear this part, go back to what Amr was saying about how long it took him to do those show notes, right? You said 6 months, right?
Yeah, pretty
Okay.
much.
So that's 6 months. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, 6 months, that makes sense. But I'm sure there's a lot of people who are thinking, whoa, that's a really long time, right? Because today, when you see offers that are anything less than making a lot of money under, I don't know, 6 weeks, it's like, okay, forget it. I don't have time for that. So I think that that's a really, I mean, in a society today, and we talk about this all the time where it's instant gratification is an expectation, right? Like 6 months. There's something really, it's a really valuable, I think, example of, sometimes the process, these things, they take time in the scheme of things, 6 months, right? Like
Yeah. And
yeah.
it's a gamble for sure. It's a big gamble. At the end, nothing. It could have been the case that nothing would have come out of it. But it's very hard to pin these things down. You're kind of going off of a hunch, and you also, I would not necessarily approach every opportunity the same way. But if you feel very strongly about something, investing in it, I still believe in that approach. I've never been kind of more the spread out kind of your CV to like a million places, for example, in terms of like looking for a job. And it was always a lot more deliberate of like choosing a company is like, all right, this is like, we need to find a way in. And it's more about, um, you know, constantly trying new things. And by the way, I kept doing the show notes while working at AJ&Smart. I did not stop immediately like, all right, now I got what I wanted. And like, I don't need to do this anymore. I kept doing the show notes until the show stopped,
Wow.
which took a while. I think so. Like I was doing it while working at AJ&Smart, not part of my official responsibilities or anything, until the show just stopped. And and the cool thing was like the investment, so obviously there was a time investment, but I had also bought the Design Sprint Masterclass. Obviously, they said when I joined, it's like, oh, but like this is something that we give to like our employees for free. And so they refunded me like what I had paid for the Design Sprint Masterclass. So
Of course they did.
I guess the lesson there is like some bets can really pay off, but the downside, so to speak, is that it can take a really long time and it can take patience. So and like it's not necessarily, this sort of thing is not necessarily doesn't conflict with doing things in a different way. So maybe somebody, if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking of like a career change, maybe they've been listening to the podcast because they're interested in the product world, but they haven't gotten into it, and they want to make the change. Maybe you could combine the two strategies. So maybe you're applying all the time to different places, but maybe you have kind of like the dream list of like 1 to 3 companies that you could take that approach with, where you're kind of doing the canvas strategy on one or all three, depending on how much time you can invest. And sometimes like you don't really need to invest a lot. Sometimes just kind of a strategic thing can be really helpful, right? So a lot of the time it depends what existing experience you already have. So, if it's a designer that wants to get a job, they might say like, "Hey, I took a look at your homepage and I found that, it could be improved in this and this and this different way. And I actually built the new version, right? And you can like click on this link and see like the new version." So that could be one way of getting somebody's attention. Or if you like have some video skills, you might do that. Or maybe somebody's listening to Tamara and like wants to work with Tamara, and Tamara right now just puts out full YouTube uh, episodes of these podcasts. And somebody says like, "Oh, but I cut them up into these clips, and now like they're very useful nuggets. And here's this thing, right?" So there can be so many different ways of doing this, and some of these things would require more specialized skills. If you're already a designer, then you can do that. What I did didn't really require any skills. It just required me to listen to the podcast and take down the show notes and spin up a blog. But sometimes the other things that you could do could also be learned fairly quickly. Like, anybody could pick up a video editor with some tutorials and on free tutorials on YouTube and learn how to cut up videos, for example. So yeah, again,
Right.
no idea if this is useful to anybody who listens to your
This is
show,
amazing.
but
No, this is amazing. And you did that without ChatGPT, right? People are listening in
right, right,
2025 and they're like,
of course,
he did that with
yeah,
without Notebook LM and just pasting in
yeah, exactly. It was
the show
all
notes.
lo-fi.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome. That's amazing. And it's so funny because the design sprint workbook is going to also be, oh no, that's not see-through. This is what I made for my company based off of the
Oh
masterclass.
wow,
I made this workbook and I pretty much just
wow,
I handed it to my manager and I was like, "Hey, why don't you check this out?"
that's amazing.
They were like, "Okay,
That's
that's
really
cool.
cool.
When we have time." Oh
So
my
cool.
goodness. Okay, so can you give us like a little quick little overview about I don't know why I'm getting blurry here. A quick little overview about the work that you're doing. You mentioned workshopping, you mentioned facilitation.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
yeah.
So at AJ&Smart, we when Sprint came out, that was all we were doing. We were just doing design sprints all the time. I first joined as the user researcher on the team. So in every design sprint, we would have one user researcher, one facilitator, and one designer. And over time, I started to do more and more of the facilitation. And then I started to kind of wear two hats of user research and facilitation. And then would have a designer like, my colleague Tim at AJ&Smart, who does amazing designs. And that's how we would work with clients. So a lot of clients would come to us and they wouldn't necessarily like be asking for a design sprint. They would say like, "Hey, there's this new product that we want to launch, but all we have is just like an idea or kind of like an opportunity or something like that. We don't have anything else." And we have kind of carved out this niche for ourselves through like a lot of like doing a lot of YouTube videos, and which is where a lot of our clients would come from, where they would say like, "Oh, I watched this video and like I want to work with you guys." And so we would work with companies at this very, very early stage of like a product's life cycle. So the initial conception of it. And we would do a design sprint for them. So we would facilitate the workshops. We would kind of contribute our ideas to the idea pool that everybody was bringing. And we would come up with a prototype. We would interview users. So we would do the kind of the user interviews part of the sprint as well. And then we would synthesize all of the feedback and give it back to the client. So that's kind of the service we've been providing for many years, which we still do. But then we started expanding beyond that, and we started taking on all sorts of different types of engagements because it was what was so valuable for most of our clients was the mechanism through which we were working with them, which was workshopping and facilitation. And so we started expanding beyond design sprints and did things like, strategy sprint and product strategy sprint and like a growth sprint and a marketing workshop, a planning workshop. And anytime we could now, like, we built up this skill set where we could look at any type of challenge that required a group of people to come together and essentially, kind of align. I'm like looking at the screen here and like it says like alignment is key. And that's the thing that most of our clients really wanted. many of them, surprisingly, right? Like when you join a design sprint, you kind of assume like, oh, the prototype is like the shiny thing that everybody's coming for, right? Like this is why everybody's here. But so many times, I would be surprised to hear when we would gather feedback at the end of the sprint, and they would be like, it's just that we're finally on the same page. And like there would be such relief in the tone of the kind of person saying that. And you could feel like that there was so much frustration that was pent up before we worked with them. And so I would say like the prototype is like the tangible, shiny part, which is always still very exciting. But what a lot of our clients come to us for is just this feeling that we came and we just had like a mess of challenges and disconnected ideas, but we came out all feeling really focused. We had a lot of momentum, and now we're just ready to execute. And so that's kind of what we deliver, or like what we strive for in any type of workshop that we're selling, essentially.
That's so awesome. That is so awesome. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, this is crazy because we're like totally at time. I mean, we're gonna probably just have to do part two because I'm sure that for everyone listening, you're like, wait, tell me more.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm always happy. Like, I'd be honored to kind of be invited again.
Absolutely. Oh my
But
gosh.
I
There's
mean, yeah.
there's
I
so much to unpack. I mean, this is
I also wouldn't be
amazing.
surprised if like somebody listens to this and they were like, "This is so random. Why'd you bring on this guy?" So
No.
no hard feelings.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, I mean, if you're up for part two, let's absolutely. That's awesome. Well,
Yeah,
this is
yeah, for
amazing.
sure.
Okay, so this
Of
is
course.
part one, everyone. We're gonna have part two where we'll dive a little bit more into, a little bit more about, this workshopping work and what it does, and the different outcomes that it produces, why they're amazing, and so forth. But I think that really just, wrapping up part one episode, there's so much here really that you shared that I think is so important, whether you're an entrepreneur listening or you're, individual contributor on a team lead, a CEO, whoever you are. There's so much, I think, to be learned in terms of the values that Amr talked about, that he embodies, but that, the practices that he took and the actions that he took to get to where he is it's a certain type of um it's a work ethic, but I feel like it's also, I don't like to use the word soft skills, but it's a, it's just, it's a certain pathway and perspective. I feel like that's not something that people like teach. It's just something that people, learn from others. And so I feel like there's so much that you gave today that, we can just to hear and to like visualize the journey that you had and that you took and the decisions that you made and how you made it. I feel like there's so much to be learned from that. So I appreciate you sharing your journey and, and going into the detail, because it's those parts that, I feel like people don't hear enough and feel very lonely, especially entrepreneurs. It can be very lonely, that journey, so just, hearing your journey and how you got to where you're at. And it's amazing. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share this, and we absolutely will do, we could do part two in terms of the tactical work and stuff, but this is awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope this, maybe like 1 out of 10 people will find value in this that
No, what do
listen.
you mean?
But yeah, I
What are
hope
you talking about? This
it's
is
useful to
awesome.
somebody out
Okay,
there.
until part two, where can people get in touch with you? Where's the
I'm
best
not
place?
super active on socials, but I do have a LinkedIn that I check twice a year. So if you want to shoot me a message and you're not super, it's not a super urgent message that you need to reply to quickly, then I will eventually get to it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do part one. We'll be back soon for part two. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite aha moment was and what you would like to hear in episode part two. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe and leave a review. And of course, please be sure to check out our awesome community where you can connect with podcast guests, like-minded professionals, and be surrounded by others excited by your success. Keep pushing for impact and unlocking unstoppable growth. See you in the community.